I'm going to pivot again to, we had mentioned duty of care a couple of times early on. So, Seth, let me come back to you. So I'm curious, um, where do companies most often fall short in their duty of care obligations, and what would good look like right now?
Sure. And I think this is a nice dovetail off of the cyber discussion. So when you look at duty of care, it needs to be what we call a one button solution. So whether it's a cyber threat that you're having, whether it's protecting your public facing CEO, protecting your travelers as they go around the world or around the United States, that duty of care support needs to be completely holistic. What you don't want to be doing is trying to juggle like 8 or 9 different vendors that do 8 or 9 different security functions because everything needs to be enmeshed now. It needs to be working together. So when you think about, how can I best serve my companies that are out there if you're on a board? It's really, hey, what is your coverage? Because it's easy to look at things from a CFO lens of how much does this cost and do we really need it? But when you look at your financials, the question to ask yourself is, do you truly understand your financial risk of not investing in security that's going to cover your business continuity, employee safeties? Are you coming up short? If you're being cheap, not to put a fine point on it, and you don't have a duty of care provider that covers cyber or that helps you in Malaysia, Myanmar, and in Buenos Aires, or they only do small parts, or if they've got a great tracking mechanism around the world, but they don't have an action arm on the ground there to help you, you're making a mistake. Because in the modern world, the days of, hey, I'm a US business and I'm going to be safe, that doesn't exist anymore. You are being targeted. You are being targeted on the cyber side. And to Tina's point, it's the cyber and the physical coming together. So you have to have a plan that can move immediately. Hyper responsive. We talked about you need to have a plan, you need to have the resources in place and the time. You've got to be able to move fast, and that equals the outcome, your positive outcome. So, for any board member that's out there, does it cover all aspects of security? Can it move fast to help me now? Because if you can just track me, you're just admiring the problem. I don't need someone else to admire the problem. I need someone to solve the problem. And oh, by the way, it needs to happen right now because there's a natural disaster, there's a coup, there's a war, there's one of my travelers got robbed. What is it? Or I've been detained at the Beijing airport. I need a solution for that. If you don't have that, then you're really going to be in a troubling position. And then finally, understand the threats of today. When you look at what's happened since Mr. Thompson's assassination, um, the thing that scares me the most right now is the normalization of violence against CEOs and corporate leaders inside of the United States and the rest of the world. But it was Sam Altman just, a few days ago. And if you look at the history of the number of key leaders that have been targeted, whether it's Minnesota politicians, crypto leaders being captured and, having fingers cut off. You look at the threats that are being leveled against people now that are the public face for their company, it's scary because right now it's really easy to be an aggressor. I have AI to help me target your pattern of life. I know how to hurt your brand because if I kill you one of, or threaten one of your key leaders, I'll have a massive brand impact. Look at United Health. I hate to keep focusing on them, but they're unfortunately a perfect example of what happens if you don't have the security in place and the unthinkable unfortunately happens. So you've got to be realistic that the world is changing rapidly. The US does not have this sort of domination in the space anymore. US businesses are being targeted. It's become normal now and celebrated to target key CEOs and leaders that are out there. Look at Luigi Mangioni's defense counsel and who's paying for it and the public upswell for him. This is abhorrent. Nobody did that for the Unabomber. Ted Kaczynski, when he was drug out, nobody got together and said, Ted had some big ideas. Maybe we should support him. That didn't exist, but it exists now, and we're seeing it more and more. This guy that tried to damage or kill Sam Altman, he called it Luigiing a whole list of tech leaders and AI leaders that he had in his target list. This is going to happen more and more and more. My basic question to every board member is this: how are you protecting your key corporate leaders? Do you have that mix of cyber, of asset security, of physical security? And are they working together? Because the speed of the threat now requires you to have a duty of care provider that does all of those things. And that's what we've been, that's what we do for our clients now because it's what the world demands. It's not a nice to have, it's a gotta have.
Yeah. Ben, directors, have that personal exposure as well when companies fail to meet their duty of care for employees. And so, what does adequate board oversight really look like in a way that would hold up to scrutiny from your perspective?
Yeah, good question. I think it what that looks like, I think, is a lot of the things that we just heard from Tina and Seth. And so, yeah, you're right. Board directors owe duties of care and duties of loyalty to their companies. Care is really the one we're focused on here, and that's sometimes referred to as Caremark duties. That's the case that articulated those. And basically, what to kind of put what Tina and Seth were saying in a legal framework, what you're going to need to show that you exercise your duty of care is that as a board, you made good faith efforts to put in place board level systems to monitor and identify and report on significant risks. You're going to have to show that you actually then did that. You didn't just put it in place and let it sit there. You're going to have to show that you're actually implementing the systems that you and management put in place to identify those risks. And then in addition to that, you're going to have to show that when the board is made aware of a red flag or an issue, that there was an adequate investigation or analysis into that issue such that you can justify whatever decision is ultimately made by the board as to how to handle that issue. And so that's the basic legal framework that's going to apply to any sort of, case against board members for their decisions on a board, and it's going to apply in these situations too. And so as long as you can show those things that you've identified key institutional risks, and that needs to be an evolving thing to Seth's point. It can't be the risks the company had 10 years ago or even 5 years ago. That needs to be an ongoing evolution to make sure you're showing that you're being responsive to current geopolitical issues and how those may impact your enterprise. As long as you're identifying those, you're putting in place adequate measures to identify and assess those risks, and then you're addressing them. And from a documentation standpoint, your minutes reflect that you're doing these things and that you've been considered and how you are thinking about responding to them. Those are the elements that are going to allow you to get in what's called the business judgment rule. And when you're in that framework, at a basic level, a court is going to defer to the decisions that the board makes under the theory that the board, you know, put in place a reasonable framework, and the court is not going to second guess business judgment decisions that are made by the board. But you have to have that framework in place in order to get to that more favorable outcome. And the framework is the stuff that we heard from Tina and from Seth. And then the other piece to that kind of is related, less so on sort of an individual board member exposure level, but certainly relevant, is kind of a securities litigation risk. And this is, more of a risk for public companies, obviously. But we see a lot of event-driven securities litigation where some circumstance happens, that circumstance causes a negative impact for enterprise, causes a drop in the stock price, and then plaintiff side uh, securities litigation lawyers are then going to be combing through your disclosures and things like that to identify some risk factor, some statement that they're going to say, oh, you underestimated the impact of this event on your company. And in fact, that happened with the war in Ukraine just a couple of years ago. There were examples of that where shareholder litigation was initiated against companies who, the argument was didn't properly disclose that risk. And so I think that's another piece, again, less so on the individual board member level, but if you're looking at sort of enterprise risk, there needs to be kind of a continued review and assessment of those disclosures and the risk factors that you're identifying to make sure that they're not just kind of a stock, oh, we don't know what's going to happen in the future. You got to make sure that they're they're targeted and they focus on what's actually happening that's going to impact your company today, so that you have those things in place in the event there is some event outside your control, but that does have an impact on your operations.
Yeah, it's really easy to fall into that. Just wrote, we've had all these risks forever listed on the 10K, but it
Right.
is really important to make sure that we're looking at all those. Thank you, Ben.
Sure.
Um, Tina, I'm going to turn to you. You sit on the board of UGI, and that's both the domestic and an international distributor and marketer of energy products and services. So, putting your board hat on now, what questions should directors be asking management teams right now about optionality, resilience, security, capital allocation? What are the right questions we should be asking?
This conflict really highlights the types of questions I think we need to spend more time asking of management. And I think the most important question right now isn't whether geopolitics matter, it's whether the organization is built for a world where disruption is persistent and not episodic. So I think the questions directors should be asking fall into a few different buckets. First, is where are we structurally exposed by geography, by corridor, by counterparty, or by regulation? And do we really understand how that exposure flows through earnings, through cash flow, and customer affordability under stress? Second, how diversified are the supply chains and logistics? So if a corridor closes and sanctions tighten or markets fragment, how quickly can we reroute supply? We have to draw on storage, we have to shift our sourcing. So cost efficiency really matters, but resilience is now a competitive advantage. And third, I think about, are we keeping pace with those rapidly changing sanctions, trade policy, energy security regulations across jurisdictions? And importantly, are we anticipating where national energy security priorities, not just markets, will shape demand, returns, and capital approvals? I also think about, are we planning for short-term spikes or sustained volatility? And do our hedging strategies, rate structures, regulatory approaches protect our customers while preserving our financial stability? I also think about, have we stress tested our physical and cyber defenses? We already talked about that. And that's really critical, especially in this type of situation. And then finally, what scenarios would force us to rethink where we invest, how long our assets last, or which markets we choose to be in? And are we balancing those, balancing near-term resilience with long-term opportunities that are created by global energy security priorities? So I think at a board level, the shift is really from monitoring those headlines to testing long-term preparedness, because in today's energy markets, disruption isn't the exception, it's the operating environment.